Reflecting on the horrors communist rule visited upon him and his countrymen in his famous Templeton lecture, Russian novelist and dissident Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn asserted, quote, "More than a half a century ago, while still a child, I heard several older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." Close quote. Having spent decades studying the Russian Revolution, reading hundreds of books, collecting hundreds of testimonies, and writing volumes on the subject, Solzhenitsyn concluded, quote, "If I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." Close quote. Ignat Solzhenitsyn, on his new book, We Have Ceased to See the Purpose, Essential Speeches of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Recognized as one of today's most gifted artists and enjoying an active career as both conductor and pianist, Ignat Solzhenitsyn's lyrical and poignant interpretations have won him critical acclaim throughout the world. Principal guest conductor of the Moscow Symphony Orchestra and conductor laureate of the Chamber Orchestra of Philadelphia, Ignat Solzhenitsyn has recently led the symphonies of Baltimore, Cincinnati, Dallas, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Seattle, and Toronto, the Nordwest Deutsche Philharmonie, the Czech National Symphony, as well as the Mariinsky Orchestra and the St. Petersburg Philharmonic. He has partnered with such world-renowned soloists as Richard Good, Gary Grafman, Gideon Kremer, Anne-Sophie Mutter, Garrick Olson, Mstislav Rostropovich, and Mitsuko Uchida. A winner of the Avery Fisher Career Grant, Ignat Solzhenitsyn serves on the faculty of the Curtis Institute of Music. He has been featured on many radio and television specials, including CBS Sunday Morning and ABC's Nightline. He is also the son of acclaimed Russian author and dissident Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, and editor of We Have Ceased to See the Purpose, a collection of his father's most consequential speeches. Ignat Solzhenitsyn, welcome.
Thank you so much, Todd.
Segment 1. Who was Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn? British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher once insisted that, quote, "When someone of the stature of Solzhenitsyn warns that the freedoms we believe in are in danger if we do not stand like granite in their defense, let us not complacently brush him aside," close quote. And upon hearing of his death in 2008, none other than the last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, offered, quote, "He was one of the first who spoke aloud about the inhuman Stalinist regime and about the people who experienced it but were not broken," close quote. So, Ignat, obviously the primer on the life of your father has got to be immense, dramatic, and extraordinarily, in depth. But if you could, as both a student of your father's life, a student of your father's work, and especially as a son, tell us, who was Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn to you?
He was a remarkable man, driven by a lifelong purpose, made all the more compelling to himself, compelling for his own daily actions, if you will, by the fact that this purpose took a while to properly come into view. Now, in the case of his choice of career, as we say now, of course, the proper word is calling in the case of an artist. That he knew from an early age, and that story is, I suppose, as old as the hills. A great writer grows up dreaming of becoming a writer, and he does. So nothing that unusual, perhaps not unusual at all there. What is unusual, it seems to me, is that the path that took him in a very circuitous fashion from growing up as a believer, as a child of a believing mother in an Russian Orthodox family, and really just his mother was his family, and then moving away and being pushed away from those values by the whole surrounding environment, of Soviet atheism, including very actively the principal of his school and the teachers of his school and his peers, who, in one famous incident, tore off his neck cross, his baptismal cross, in a way of, what are you hiding? To expose him. But all of that had a predictable effect in the end, so that by the time he was in high school and certainly in university, he had become very much a cookie-cutter, young Marxist, idealist intellectual. And it was only during the war that he began to understand. He was fighting in the Red Army from 42 to 45. He was beginning to understand what's what and which way is up and down. And even so, he had thought this was just Stalin's fault, a misconception that lingers in many Westerners to this day. And usually the more educated they are, the more misinformed they are on this topic. Lenin was wonderful. Communism is tremendous in principle. It's just that one man. Yeah. So only when he was arrested at the front in February of 45, found himself at the very, 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 very bottom of society, even of Soviet society, rotting on prison straw, to use one of his expressions, that he began to really see what's what, and to began to see life's purpose, and the purpose of his own life in particular. And he never wavered after that time. Once he emerged from the camps and he emerged from his miraculous recovery from a cancer that was supposed to kill him in a matter of weeks, all of this set his mind and his heart straight as to his gratitude for the gift of life that he would have for decades more, as to his duty towards his fellow countrymen in general, but specifically his fellow zeks, in other words, inmates, friends and acquaintances, and people he'd never met, but people who were inside for no reason, including especially those writers whose work would never see the light of day, because they were killed, because their works were burned, because their spirits were broken, and so forth. And so in that second way, his sense of duty, his sense of his own life's purpose is to speak for those, as he says in the dedication of the Gulag Archipelago, speak for those who cannot speak. And then the third aspect of life's purpose, in a sense the most important, as he saw it, was to leave life a better person than one entered it. Or as he says in the Harvard Address, which is included in this anthology of speeches, if man were born only to be happy, he would not be born also to die. So I suppose that's a fair characterization of Solzhenitsyn, the person, at what animated him, what drove him. And then, yes, you mentioned as a father, he was a wonderful father. He was a funny and engaging and humble person. He was inspiring to be around. He was an amazing teacher, whether he was teaching physics or mathematics, which was his profession after all for many years, whether he was teaching about life, so to speak, in conversation, and a caring, loving husband and father, and a great man, in short.
So, Ignat, we have ceased to see the purpose is a collection, as you've mentioned. The part of why we're talking about this is a collection of speeches composed and offered by your father from the years 1972 to 1997. You've just illustrated why we should be reading your father's work, because he is an extraordinary person with astounding courage. I mean, an iron will, but also profoundly a champion of that which is human in an inhuman system. So given the immense work published by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn over the last half century, why did you deem it was important to release a collection of his speeches now?
Well, there's never a bad time to engage with the big questions.
Right.
In fact, you could say every time is the right time. And then specifically with these speeches, several of them had been out of print for a while, which was a shame. And several of them had not appeared in English ever, or certainly not in book form, but only somewhere in a periodical, and in other words, again, effectively out of print. And thirdly, an anthology or a collection specifically of his speeches had never been published before, not even in Russian. I cannot say for sure it hasn't in some other European languages, but certainly not in the original Russian, and not in our target language here in English. And so it seemed to be a volume worth pursuing and worth bringing to the world. And as you mentioned, we can see over the just about exactly quarter century from the Nobel lecture, which is the one piece of this volume that's still written in the Soviet Union before his eventual exile in 1974, and then all the way through to 1997, fast forwarding through not actually fast forwarding because the 8 speeches in the middle are from the West, but I mean ending, I should say, with his speech upon his induction into the Academy of Sciences in Russia, a speech that ruminates upon the purposes and future of culture. And is called The Depletion of Culture. A very, very interesting text, not at all known in the West heretofore. So it seemed like the right time to bring this out, whether for people who are already readers and knowers and thinkers about Solzhenitsyn, who may be interested in a different facet of his works. For example, people who love his fiction but want to know more or engage more with this public figure or publicistic side of his writings, or in some ways even more for someone who hasn't read his fiction, or someone who thinks of Solzhenitsyn, if I may say inappropriately, but understandably, first and foremost as a political figure or as a dissident. Fair enough, it's understandable why people might think of him that way. And in that case, I think this volume may appeal to them even more because it appears to deal with political hot-button issues of the day, although in truth, as you, I'm sure, discovered looking through this volume, that, of course, he's never interested in left and right, win and lose, but he's interested in the human soul and the repercussions of our actions.
Segment 2, Speaking Truth. In winning the 1970 Nobel Prize for Literature for the ethical force with which he has pursued the indispensable traditions of Russian literature, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn gave a speech in which he warned, quote, "Let us not forget that violence does not and cannot exist by itself. It is invariably intertwined with the lie. They are linked in the most intimate, organic, and profound fashion. Violence can conceal itself with nothing except the lie, and the lie has nothing to uphold it save violence. Anyone who has once proclaimed violence as his method must inexorably choose the lie as his principle," close quote. But then he is encouraged in insisting, quote, "As for writers and artists, it is within their power to do more, to defeat the lie." And then he quotes a Russian proverb, "One word of truth shall outweigh the whole world," close quote. So, Ignat, we hear this in our Christian faith, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free, as well as other dissidents like Czeslaw Miłosz, who wrote, quote, "In a room where people unanimously maintain a conspiracy of silence, one word of truth sounds like a pistol shot," close quote. What is it about the truth that is so devastating to systems of vicious deception?
What is devastating or exhilarating, but since you mentioned the systems of deception and systems of control what is devastating about truth is that axiomatically it is true. It is absolute. It is real. And there is no answer for that. I would suggest that the same answer would apply really with very little modification to an impeccably credentialed Western academic questioning the old-fashioned, outdated, outmoded notion of absolute truth. The same question would, or the same answer would also obtain, I suppose, in the conversation between Christ and Pilate. If memory serves, Christ gives no answer to Pilate to what is truth, but he very well could have given an answer.
Right.
Obviously, a very effective answer from a argumentational perspective. He doesn't for his own reasons, but we know that for truth there is no cure, or there is no vaccine, or whatever would be the right metaphor. We see that in Solzhenitsyn's own life. By the way, a great part of his humility as a person and as an artist came from the very humbling experiences that he underwent in his own life. Humbling in the literal sense, yes, that when he was humbled by being arrested, when he was humbled by being beaten, and humbled by being mocked, and humbled by everything else. But equally and more so humbled by the success he had, and humbled by the unforeseen ways in which his works impacted the world. And so that publication, that famous publication, I think still famous even in this country, to those, of course, who have some knowledge of Cold War history and Soviet history and Russian literature history, the publication in 1962, November, in those same weeks as the Cuban Missile Crisis, by the way, of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, that short story about the camps, about really just one day in the camps of one regular Ivan Denisovich. Ivan Denisovich is, Joe Schmo, or everyman. Ivan Denisovich is just a guy. But Khrushchev had mistakenly thought that in order to differentiate himself from the so-called cult of personality, which was a euphemism, and of course everything in a totalitarian system is a euphemism, as we know from George Orwell, the euphemism cult of personality stood in for Stalin. And so to distance himself from that, he said, why don't we show that we're not so bad? I'm not so bad. Yeah. And one of the ways to do that was this short story came along. This was, this might be good because we don't have that anymore. So it might be good for people to learn a little bit. Well, what happened was that drop of truth, which really all it was in an ocean of lies, created a kind of, stick with water, a hydrogen bomb effect. It was an absolute psychological bomb, this one word of truth, which effectively that story was, that opened the floodgates to a completely different understanding of Soviet reality. Because for the first time, as Solzhenitsyn read in hundreds upon hundreds of letters addressed to him in those short weeks of his official fame and acceptance, hundreds of people wrote to say, for the first time, the truth about us has been told. The truth about our country has been told. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And building on that, they provided, many of them former Czechs, further testimonies about other camps and their own experiences that, beyond the topic of our conversation today, but that directly inspired and fortified him to the great task of actually writing the Gulag Archipelago, which could not have been written based only on his own experience, which required the succor and the numbers and the support of these 257 other witnesses of that system. So all of this happened because one word of truth was unleashed unwittingly at the hands of the Soviets themselves Khrushchev's ill-considered, from his point of view, decision.
It's fascinating. It makes me think of the Berlin Wall, how it seems like when the Berlin Wall started to fall, it was a little bit of an inadvertent bureaucratic oversight that ultimately led to pickaxes and the ultimate collapse of it. Obviously this wasn't this was ill considered by a totalitarian state, and obviously, as you said, it was just dramatic in terms of what its effects are. Ignat, I want to ask you, truth isn't only necessary for totalitarian regimes, but for the free West. This is one of the recurring themes with your father that just has always struck me. In his 1976 speech, If One Doesn't Wish to Be Blind, Solzhenitsyn laments after 2 years of living in the West, quote, I couldn't have imagined to what extreme degree the West desires to blind itself to the world situation, to what extreme degree the West has already become a world of lost will, a world gradually petrifying in the face of danger, a world oppressed above all by the necessity of defending its freedom, close quote. So returning to our opening excerpt, is this capacity for self-deception and self-serving rationalization due to a dried up wellspring of religious faith? And do we avoid the honorable thing because we have become intoxicated with pleasure in the West and have indeed forgotten God?
According to Solzhenitsyn, yes, it appears to be so. It is natural for human beings, for all of us, to enjoy, even crave material comforts. That doesn't have to be wicked per se. And it depends on how we define material comforts. Is a hot bowl of soup after a long day's labor, is that somehow corrupting or inappropriate? Of course it's not. It's we are human, we are spirit, we think, right? Mm-hmm. But we are also flesh. Mm-hmm. That's certainly everybody would agree. And so we have those needs of the flesh, and we have we live in the material world, and pretending otherwise or wishing that weren't so is also a kind of a weird heresy or bizarre kind of ideological twist. So we are both mind and body. We are spirit, flesh and soul. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, Solzhenitsyn very much believed that there is some kind of one of our challenges as a species is to find the right balance between those two aspects of our nature. And in his view, summarily, in the Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, and perhaps through the Renaissance certainly until the Enlightenment and no later, there was perhaps a disbalance, an imbalance in favor of the spirit. The flesh was considered wicked. The flesh was considered, I can't wait to shuffle off this mortal coil, and all of that. And so it was all about the spirit to the detriment of the other part of our, if you will, sacred nature. But then things turned to such a degree in the last 300 years, more or less, not even, that the material has become supreme. So much so that even to have the conversation you and I are having now requires, it's a conversation that can hardly be had between two random people,
right,
so to speak. Chances are, if two random people, it seems to me, try to have one of them initiates this conversation, the other one will say, "What are you going on about? I'm not sure I even know what's your frame of reference." And so we've gone too far the other way, in the sense that if the only thing that matters is the material, if the only thing that matters is my well-being, is my advancement, is the comfort of my body, is the numbers in my bank account, and so forth, then and most of all, there is nothing after, then the world becomes very terrifying. Life itself becomes very terrifying. And then, yes, the idea that a society should have to defend itself, but that would require effort, that would require arms, that would require courage, that would require possibly dying. And what's all that for if after I die, the universe is extinguished?
Right.
And that's, of course, the conceit conscious or very likely subconscious, at the heart of an atheist perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we believe, I suppose, scientifically that the universe will likely go on another so many billion years, but fundamentally, after I die, the universe is done.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems that is the cause of a lack of courage, of a lack of empathy, of a lack of principle. It stems from ultimately that one anthropocentric source, if you will.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization of Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization of Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. Will we be saved? In his 1983 Templeton lecture, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn cautioned, quote, Dostoevsky warned that, quote, great events could come upon us and catch us intellectually unprepared, close quote. This is precisely what happened. And he predicted that, quote, the world will be saved only after being visited by the demon of evil, close quote. Will it be saved? We shall have to wait and see. This will depend on our conscience, on our spiritual lucidity, on our individual and combined efforts in the fact of catastrophic circumstances. Forgive me, I got to start that over because I said fact, not face. So, Nate, going back to segment 3, okay? Segment 3, will we be saved? In his 1983 Templeton lecture, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn cautioned, quote, Dostoevsky warned that, quote, great events could come upon us and catch us intellectually unprepared, close quote. This is precisely what happened. And he predicted that, quote, the world will be saved only after being visited by the demon of evil, close quote. Will it be saved? We shall have to wait and see. This will depend on our conscience, on our spiritual lucidity, on our individual and combined efforts in the face of catastrophic circumstances. But it has already come to pass that the demon of evil, like a whirlwind, triumphantly circles the 5 continents of the earth, close quote. So, Ignat, did your father think that society could be saved?
Well, in a word, yes.
Mm-hmm.
He famously described himself in response to a question along those lines in the BBC film about his homecoming to Russia. He described himself as a pessimistic optimist. And not because he was trying to fudge the answer, but to say that, yes, he's often pessimistic in the short term because of what life has taught him, because of what he has seen. But yes, optimistic in the long run, of course, because without hope,
right,
and without how can we live?
Right.
I mean, hope is everything. It's just that if it's an ill-considered hope or an unlikely hope, we have to take appropriate action, perhaps. But where belief crosses into hope or vice versa, that's an interesting question of itself that I continue to think about. But yes, in a word, yes. Now, I would also hasten to add that salvation in that personal sense, in the sense that Christians understand salvation, of course, is beyond the purview, beyond the ken of Solzhenitsyn or any one of us. That salvation lies in one pair of hands only.
Mm-hmm.
But in Solzhenitsyn's view, that by no in no way means that we should live passively,
Right.
and that we should simply see what happens and put our trust in the Lord, put our trust in God is a dual-edged sword. It's an essential component, I think, of a humble life of any person, of any religion who understands that there is a higher purpose and a higher spirit above us. But at the same time, it can be an excuse to do nothing. And no matter what happens, that's God's will. That's a passivity that I reject, and I think Solzhenitsyn would reject it, and I think most well-minded people will reject. So therefore, that means we have to fight. We have to fight in whatever way for the values and the beliefs and and for each other. I wanted to say for the values that we hold to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, society, it's never too late. Perhaps at some point it will be, but it doesn't seem it's too late yet.
Mm-hmm.
But that requires some preponderance, some plurality, maybe some majority of people, of individual human beings, to act accordingly.
Yeah.
And I suppose to conclude that answer, it's very difficult for society to act. And this is where so many of the totalitarian impulses go off the rails. Because it is difficult to move. It's difficult to move the ship of state, to turn it.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to get a whole bunch of people to agree to do X. It's just by definition. It's very difficult to get 50 people. It's difficult to get 5 people to agree. What movie do you want to see tonight?
Yeah.
Everyone's going to have their own idea. And so the easiest way to do that is to force them. Yes, and they won't even know. They don't even know. They need to be forced. They need to be compelled, because then they will be happy when it's done.
Yeah.
And that's the great totalitarian temptation. But if we don't succumb to that temptation, then the only way ultimately to change society, to improve society, to ameliorate social problems, ultimately the only way is to work on ourselves. And as Solzhenitsyn says, to move, to push along, to push away that line between good and evil that oscillates and crosses between right through each of our hearts. None of us are wholly good. None of us are wholly evil. So that percentage, or where that line crosses, or what portion is good and what portion is evil, that we can change during our lifetimes, and that has to be our primary goal.
Yeah.
And if enough people do that, then perhaps society will be on its way toward a, shall we use a communist term, a brighter future.
St. John Paul II once remarked, quote, "Freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought," close quote. Our consciences guide us, but our consciences must be properly formed and not deformed by atheism, selfishness, decadence. Solzhenitsyn talks about inner freedom and honor in his 1976 speech, The Shallowing of Freedom. Ignat, could you reflect on your father's sense of inner freedom?
Inner freedom is the freedom that cannot be taken away, that cannot be prohibited, proscribed, legislated. Inner freedom is utterly independent of social constructs, social mores, governmental regulations. It's even independent of the absolute and cruel and senseless and brutal diktats of your prison guard and of the administration of your labor camp, who are judge, jury, and executioner all in one, or who are both Tsar and God in the Russian expression. In other words, they're everything. They can do as they wish. Nobody will ever know. Nobody will ever report them. They do as they wish. So it's absolute power. And by logical extension, then their prisoners are absolute slaves. They have zero freedom. And as clearly true as that is on the surface, But if one of those, or two, or many, one of those zeks, one of those prisoners, and of course this applies on the double for any of us anywhere in a more fortunate situation on the planet. But if one of those prisoners chooses inner freedom, no one can take it away. And that's really worth thinking about it.
Yeah.
Worth thinking about, because it's a state of mind. It's a moral decision. It's a moral evaluation, it seems to me, of what matters in life, and by extension, everything else that doesn't matter or doesn't really matter. And any one of us can make that kind of choice and therefore can be free. And I think from a Christian perspective, when we understand that we are given freedom by God, given freedom, the gift of freedom, that is the gift.
Yeah.
The Declaration of Independence isn't the gift of freedom, or the Bill of Rights isn't the gift of freedom.
Right.
Marvelous as those documents may be, they are attempts to put it in to put it in forms that can govern society, and well that they should. But they don't give us freedom. The freedom can only come from one source, and in a sense can only be activated by ourselves. And in that sense, it's a gift that every single human being who has ever lived, or who lives now, or who ever will live, has that within his purview. And if that's the case, how truly self-empowering and wonderful that is.
Ignat, one last question. Thank you for the generosity of your time. How have you been changed by revisiting and re-releasing these seminal speeches by your father? And what do you hope they will achieve in the minds and the souls of those who engage with them?
I hope that, if I may say, and I think we're allowed to quote, "They that have ears, let them hear." That's a concept that holds a great deal of personal importance for me in my professional life as a musician. And also, I often adapt it, even in music, because our music comes from, in the case of interpreting other people's music, which is what I do, whether it's Bach or Beethoven or a composer writing today, it comes from another person. And therefore, I need to read the music before I can understand it and hear it and interpret it. And so they that have eyes, let them read. Can be adapted in that way as well. Certainly in the case of literature, that works very well. In other words, it's there. The insights are there. The invitation to self-examine is there, which, as we know from Socrates, is the greatest intellectual gift that which has been bestowed upon us. The ability to look inside, to ask, who am I and why am I here? All of that is in this slender volume of speeches. And so, yes, I would hope that certain people at certain times in their lives will pick it up, whether mindfully and intentionally, as they say now, or accidentally, so to speak, and be changed to one degree or another by what's in there. And to go back to the first part of your question, how have I been changed? I think great literature and great art continually changes us and enlightens us and elevates us. And in working very, very closely on these texts, I've been reminded of so much that Solzhenitsyn insisted on, or so much that he invited us to question and that he questioned himself. And just reminded that about that most obvious insight, which we all run away from, I think, day after day, which is that our life grows shorter by the day, whether we are 7 or 77. Everyone is a day closer to the grave today than yesterday. That's factually indisputable. Mm-hmm. And therefore, whether that day is tomorrow or that day is in many decades, we need to use the time we have for good.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately Solzhenitsyn reminds us, let's all try and do just that.
Ignat Solzhenitsyn, acclaimed conductor, editor, and son of the lion, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Thank you so much for this conversation. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
Likewise, tremendous pleasure, Todd. Thank you so much for having me on.
So I've been thinking, a prolific author of dozens of novels and novellas, plays and poems, histories and memoirs, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was a devoted son of Russia, a Nobel Prize winner, and a voice of conscience against a totalitarian Soviet Union and a distracted and often decadent West. Imprisoned in the Soviet Gulag network for writing a letter critical of leader Joseph Stalin, Solzhenitsyn suffered immensely. But he wrote a history of the Soviet nightmare called the Gulag Archipelago, which was released in Paris, France in 1973. It earned him international acclaim as well as immediate exile from his home country. Now, this brief primer on the life of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn hardly does justice to such a titanic figure in the ideological dramas of the 20th century. So how can one justly characterize, epitomize, or capture the massive figure of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn? Perhaps his son Ignat said it the best. Solzhenitsyn and his work are a drop of truth in an ocean of lies. What happens when lies dominate a society? When the leaders deceive, the experts fib, and the writers equivocate, the politics become a tool for seizing and maintaining power, and the culture becomes decadent before plunging into nihilism. And so when the truth is ultimately spoken, as Czesław Miłosz once wrote, it sounds like a pistol shot. Our faith is rooted in unabashed, uncompromising, and absolute truth, the unwavering criterion of Christ by which all things are illuminated and judged. And it is this truth that set Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn free, even while he was still in prison. Winston Churchill once asserted, "The truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is." The figure of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn and the words he has written and spoken emphatically remind us about the true nature of being human, a dignified child of God amidst a notoriously inhuman world. About the true, Solzhenitsyn would echo Churchill, "In the end, there it is." And one last thing. Be sure to read We Have Ceased to See the Purpose, the essential speeches of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, edited by his son Ignat. But also be sure to dive into Solzhenitsyn's other works, including One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago. Certainly, these works will plunge you into the darkness of which man is oftentimes capable, but it will also remind you of the light that forever outshines it. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization and Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner. Until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.